I'm Charles Overby, chairman of the Overby Center. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for what I think will be one of the most remarkable and important programs that we've ever had here at the Overby Center. I'm going to try to resist any rhetorical flourish because our panelists can provide that in much better than I can. I will only say that from where I sat when I was 14 years old in Jackson, Mississippi, I never dreamed that the events that were taking place that year would be celebrated 60 years later with a lot of hope and a lot of water under the bridge. I have three things I want to do before I turn this over to the panel. The first one is I want to thank Kathleen Wickham and Larry Wells for being the brains behind the book that brought these distinguished people together. Kathleen's holding up the book. There's some self-interest in her holding that book up because the book will be for sale afterwards outside, and Kathleen is going to sign it, and maybe some others will too.
Everyone.
Yes, they're essays. As you know, this book's got more publicity than most books I'm familiar with. They have how many different essays in it, Kathleen?
I don't know. It's the one in the New York Sun that blew me away.
Yeah, a lot of good reviews, and you'll hear more about it. But anyway, that was the genesis for this program tonight. And Larry, we thank you for your great publishing touch. The second thing I want to do is to say that this is a prelude this week to the celebration of our own Curtis Wilkie going into the Ole Miss Alumni Hall of Fame. So across the way on Thursday night, there'll be several hundred people there to see Curtis inducted into the Hall of Fame. But here tonight, these are your people, Curtis, and we're glad that we can celebrate with you. And the last thing that I want to do is to introduce our moderator, who's going to take over the program from there. Jesse Holland, he's one of Ole Miss's great alumni. He was editor of the Daily Mississippian. I was thinking about it on the way down. I would say he is one of the two most accomplished, still practicing journalists who are alumni of Ole Miss. He's multimedia. He's been an accomplished reporter for the Associated Press. He's written several books that have gotten national acclaim, and he's now about to start on a documentary, and he's a regular on C-SPAN as a host. Plus he teaches at George Washington University. He's done a little bit of all of it, and we're so proud of Jesse for what he has done. And he has an essay in Kathleen's book, and he's going to moderate tonight's program and introduce our distinguished panelists. Jesse, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. First and foremost, I always have to say it's great to be home. Once again, my name is Jesse J. Holland. I am a guest host on Washington Journal's C-SPAN's Washington Journal, an opinion columnist for MSNBC.com, assistant professor of journalism at the George Washington School of Media and Public Affairs, but most importantly, class of 1994, University of Mississippi. Before we get started, I just want to say how important it is that we're doing this. We are witnessing history right now as the University of Mississippi commemorates the 60th anniversary of James Meredith integrating our university. And we often say, especially in journalism, that journalism is the first draft of history, that what we know about ourselves as a country comes first from our reporters, our columnists, our editors, our photographers, our videographers. But because journalism is a first draft of history, we also need to question it and analyze it as we do all of the other history in our country to make sure that we are getting what we need from it. And that is, it is reflecting what it should. So I think it's really appropriate that we're going to talk about how the media covered the University of Mississippi and James Meredith 60 years ago, what we did right and what we did wrong, and how we and what we know about that time is reflected in what the reporters, editors, photographers, and videographers of that day did, and what we can learn from this, and what we can take and move into the future with this information. Now, that's enough for me, because we have a panel here who are some of the most knowledgeable journalists about that time, people who were there. And I want y'all to hear from them. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start a conversation up here. And we're going to, the four of us, we're going to talk for a while. But I also want you to take part in the conversation as well. So somewhere about 30, 45 minutes into this, I'm going to open it up to your questions. There'll be a microphone available. So if you have any questions for our distinguished journalists, that you're able to ask them as well. Because one of the things I've learned is that we ask great questions. Not me. We do. There are questions that you're going to have that I didn't think of. And I want you to be able to ask those questions. So let me first introduce our great panel here. Let's start all the way down on the end. So, as editor of the University of Mississippi student newspaper, The Daily Mississippian, Memphis native Sidna Broward Mitchell turned out a special edition during the violent 1962 campus demonstrations and wrote an editorial that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. After graduating from Ole Miss, she had a Scripps Howard internship working as a general reporter on the World Telegram and Sun in New York City, and then as a deskman for UPI in London. Later, she was director of employee communications for Citibank, where she met her husband. Moving to New Jersey, the Mitchells purchased a weekly newspaper, for which Sidna wrote a weekly cooking column for 42 years. Ultimately, she joined the New Jersey Council on Affordable Housing, retiring as deputy director in 2002. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sidna Broward Mitchell.
Thank you.
Now, sitting next to me, Dr. Kathleen Woodruff Wickham is a professor in the School of Journalism and New Media here at the University of Mississippi. She is the author of We Believed We Were Immortal, 12 reporters who covered the 1962 integration crisis at Ole Miss. In 2009, she applied for a grant to install a plaque and memorial bench honoring Agence France Presse reporter Paul Guihard, who was killed on campus September 30th, 1962 during the Meredith integration riots. In 2010, she presented a Society of Professional Journalists program, Without Fear and With Courage, honoring the reporters who covered the Ole Miss integration crisis, designating the Ole Miss campus as a national historical journalism site. For 15 years, she served as a judge for the National Headliner Journalism Awards. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kathleen Wickham. Last but definitely not least, Curtis Wilkie serves as a fellow for the Overby Center of Southern Journalism Politics at the University of Mississippi. His books, which if you haven't read all of them, shame on you. You should read all of them. Include Dixie, a personal odyssey through events that shaped the modern South, The Fall of the House of Zeus, the rise and ruin of America's most powerful trial lawyer, and Assassins, Eccentrics, Politicians, and Other Persons of Interest. At the Boston Globe, he served as a national and foreign correspondent and covered 8 presidential campaigns. He was the Globe's White House correspondent from 1977 to 1982 and served as its Washington bureau chief. He was also Middle East bureau chief for the Globe and covered such events as the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, and the first Gulf War. Ladies and gentlemen, Curtis Wilkie. So first, I want to start by setting the scene back in 1962. Sidna, you were a student here.
Yes.
Curtis, you were a working journalist covering this.
Student.
You were a student as well. So you were both students back here. So set the scene for us. What was it like being a student, and not just a student, but a student journalist on campus during the Meredith integration riots? Sidna, start us off.
Well, first of all, the Daily Mississippian second year as a daily, and I was told that I had to get it into the black or it would go back as a weekly. So I was really more concerned about how was I going to do that, what would interest the students, what would get up the circulation and the advertising. And then all hell broke loose. And I now say I thank James Meredith that we did get into the black. And I also thank James Meredith that I got a lot of job offers as a basis of the editorials. But unfortunately, we saw a campus that was normally concerned about football games, sorority, fraternity, rush, parties. Just ask Curtis about them. And then all of a sudden, we've got politics involved. And it was on the federal level with Kennedy and with the local level with Ross Barnett. Everything was pretty quiet until the Kentucky game in Jackson. And I understand y'all are playing Kentucky again this weekend. We had to listen to Ross Barnett talk about I love Mississippi and roll with Ross. This was a man who wouldn't show up on campus because he would get tomatoes thrown at him. And all of a sudden, he was a hero. And it was very concerning about what would happen when we got back to campus. And indeed, when I got back, there were federal marshals surrounding the Lyceum, elbow to elbow, standing there. And how they stood there as long as they did, I'll never understand. And Curtis was, I think, here earlier, and you probably saw more of what was happening as they loaded up.
Yeah, I got back like everybody from the football game in Jackson Sunday afternoon, and heard that the marshals had taken control of the Lyceum. And so I went up as, curiosity, see what was going on, and sure enough, the Lyceum was surrounded by, I think, roughly about 400 U.S. Marshals in battle gear, and so clearly things had changed dramatically overnight. This is a crisis that had been building for 10 days from the first day that Meredith came on campus to enroll, and the governor had declared himself the registrar of the school and turned him away. And there had been 2 or 3 other attempts by Meredith to enroll, and each time he had been rejected. Meanwhile, the courts had said, you must enroll this man. And the state government and the governor were adamant that we would not. And so the university was plunged into this crisis not of our making. I needed 3 hours to graduate. I thought that the state was going to close the school. I thought it was conceivable that Mississippi would try to secede from the Union again. That's how crazy it was. So that Sunday afternoon, it was a crowd of several hundred people, all students, because they had checkpoints, and nobody could get onto campus unless they had an ID. And as it began to get dark, it began to get a little bit ugly. A couple of news people, they were TV people or photographers, were attacked. And it's a handful of students had been taunting the marshals and throwing stuff at them, but most of us were not involved. And suddenly, out of nowhere, they fired a volley of tear gas into the middle of us. And I mean, dozens of rounds of tear gas. And it's the first time I was ever gassed, and it was not pleasant. And so that kind of set it off, and it deteriorated through the night because the checkpoints were dropped by the state government, and State Highway Patrol abandoned them, and they let hundreds of these people who had come in without any kind of probably high school education, with their guns and their clubs and probably their pitchforks, and took over the disturbance, and it went on all night. And it was the circle in front of the Lyceum was it felt like it was a free fire zone, although we later learned that the marshals were not using live ammunition, but rather it was tear gas that they were using. But there were, just hundreds of rounds of shots being fired, people being wounded, and it was crazy.
Kathleen, I want to bring you in here, but just before I do, I want to ask Sidna, as a journalist at that time, how are you figuring out what part of this you can write? Because you have media from around the country
Right.
doing the big picture. How were you as a student journalist saying, okay, here's our piece of it, what do we say?
Well, I met actually with other student leaders and next to the Lyceum, and we were talking about how we could bring about calm. I have to apologize to you folks over here. I'm an old lady with a bad neck, so I can't really turn to me. But we were talking about what we could do to bring calm, and obviously I felt a newspaper, get it out, and because normally we would not have come out except on Tuesday, and this would have been for Monday. But we didn't finish that discussion because the tear gas started and we had to leave. My managing editor at that time was Jan Umber, and I told Jan to do the reporting aspect of what was happening because I needed to get back to the journalism building, consider an editorial, and get a newspaper out. So that's what I did. The journalism building at that time was at the corner of, I guess, Rebel Drive and University Drive, and what was a house. Much better than when Curtis and I started and we were in a leaky Quonset hut. But I had left the doors open because I told the media that they could use our telephones, our typewriters, and our dark room. But the people, as Curtis said, that were coming from the outside were frightening. And I'll never forget when this man and his young boy were at the front door and demanded to know where that damn inn man was because they were here to kill him. And I said, whoops, better close the doors and lock them. And then shortly thereafter, I was working with a photographer in the dark room, and there was a knock on the door, and we were told that a journalist had been shot, and they thought that it was the Frenchman. And the photographer said, "Oh my God, that's my man." And he left. And indeed, it was Paul Guihard that had been shot.
That's a good point for us to bring you in, Kathleen. Not on a really depressing
I know.
point, but you've talked and worked with many of the journalists who came from outside campus to cover
Yes.
the riot that was going on. What were they expecting to see when they got here, and what did they actually see and experience here on campus?
I'm not sure, what they were expecting. Reporters like Claude Sitton of the New York Times oh, was known as the dean of the civil rights reporting, and he had covered most of the major events across the South. So he had seen violence and chaos previously, and he came equipped with a whole team, and they stayed at the Old Miss Motel. And it hasn't improved over the years, but they chose that one because they believed it was owned by a member of the KKK, and they figured they would be safe there, that the KKK wouldn't firebomb a fellow KKK member's hotel.
And these are things you have to think about as a journalist.
And for some of the reporters, for Dan Rather, for example, it was his first national broadcast, so he didn't have much experience covering riots per se. I don't think he had done a hurricane yet, but anyhow, he was more concerned with getting air time and issue. For many of the reporters, you have to remember this was before we had cell phones, and so accessing a phone was always a bit of a challenge, and finding a phone that you could use. And there was some sharing going on among the reporters, which was kind of interesting to find out because we're so competitive. But in the middle of a crisis, you're not. I think the reporters overall were shocked that when they turned on their equipment, the rioters went after them to destroy their equipment. One reporter, a Texas broadcaster, was pulled out of his car, and his wife was also attacked because they saw that he had television equipment. And for all of them, it was a life-changing experience. There was no other event. Those who I was able to interview, who are still with us, no event in the past or since then that marked covering a riot on a college campus. That was an entirely new reporting experience.
And then you had the journalists like Dorothy Gillum, who had to do their job as journalists and be black at the same time. And she wrote a little bit about this in the book.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what she said? And by the way, one of the greatest pleasures of my life is being able to sit down at dinner with Dorothy and have her tell me stories of Mississippi, a Mississippi that was before my time, and talk about how journalism has and has not changed from those days. So tell us a little bit about what the black journalists like Dorothy went through.
Well, I'll start with Moses Newsom, because Moses Newsom was from the Baltimore Afro-American, was not allowed to come on campus for his own safety. He was banned by the university because of his race, even though they appealed, and they were not able to get, I can't remember the other guy's name, Jimmy Hicks and Moses Newsom were not allowed to go on campus. But Dorothy Gilliam was the first African-American woman hired by the Washington Post, and she was hired just a few months before she was sent here. Her bosses at the Washington Post would not let her come until after the riot. They were concerned about her own safety. But she had been in Little Rock, and she was like, I've been in Little Rock, I can handle Mississippi. And so after she arrived, I think it was October 2nd, and when she came south, the photographer she was with assured her, we were going to find it. You're worried about housing. It's segregated. I mean, everything. When you were black, you had to worry about where you were going to sleep, where you were going to get food. You had to worry about if you stayed with somebody, were there going to be night walkers in the house? How safe were you going to be? But they found housing in one of the most quietest places in Oxford, a funeral home. Stayed with the family in the funeral home. And then she set out to find out how the blacks in Oxford were experiencing all this trauma, and found out many of them fled. They left town. Those who stayed were very careful when they went out to go to the grocery store. If they didn't have to go out, they didn't go out. If they had to go out, it was quick, in, out, go to your place, don't do anything else. She described it as the most terrifying experience to be a black American and not to feel in the least bit safe within the community.
Now, Curtis, with the benefit of hindsight, did the media do Oxford and Ole Miss justice in the national coverage? Not just, well, I shouldn't say just the national coverage, but the local coverage. We were, as a industry, the media was just learning how to cover the civil rights movement. But when it came to Ole Miss and Oxford, did we do it right?
I think it was a mixed bag, Jesse. Back then we weren't terribly sophisticated about the press. It was exciting being a journalism student here with the biggest story in the world going on campus for nearly 2 weeks. But my impression is that by and large, the national press that was here was prepared. Kathleen mentioned Claude Sitton from the New York Times. A lot of these papers had Southerners covering the civil rights beat. And so therefore, they spoke the language and could kind of fit in. I remember it was the Time magazine sent this Yankee dandy down here that looked terribly out of place. But my impression is, and we couldn't read online what these people were writing, but I think generally they did a good job. Where the breakdown was, where I'd be most critical, were the Jackson newspapers.
Amen.
Which were arguably the most racist newspapers in America. And they didn't even bother to send reporters up here to cover the story. The stories they ran would be Associated Press, so they could, it's reporting this, it's, the evil AP or something. And then, meanwhile, all of their columnists were weighing in with the most outrageous kind of commentary about what was going on here. I think there were something like 300 reporters who were accredited to be here. So the campus is crawling with journalists, and a lot of them were from other papers in the state. I know the paper that a few months later I went to work for in Clarksdale, they had somebody here covering it. There were a number of small dailies in the state who were covering it, and I think probably did a credible job. But the real failure was our own biggest newspaper in the state, the two of them, the Clarion Ledger and sister paper, the Jackson Daily News.
And Sydney, you helped put college journalism, especially in the South, on the map with your editorials. What type of pressure were you feeling, not just from students, but from administration, for you to sit down and shut up? Because I'm sure that's what they wanted you to do, is to stop writing, and hopefully this will all blow over one day. So I'd be surprised if you tell me that they didn't.
They did not.
Really?
I was never told what I should or should not write by the administration. And later, Chancellor Williams wrote me a letter and thanked me for my editorials. He was really this wasn't in the letter, but he was really between a rock and a hard place with the alumni and with the Board of Trustees at that point. because I got, I must say, good national media, local media, not so good, thanks to the Jackson papers. But I was really concerned in terms of my editorials, which to me were basically "Don't riot, boys." My father's business was primarily in Mississippi, and he was in the dairy and food supply business, talking about small dairies and your Dairy Queens and that type of business. And he had only started it a few years before. So I was very concerned about what I wrote would impact his business. And when I expressed my concern, Daddy said, "Don't worry, write what you think is right." And I did. And I had him to thank for a number of things. One that he always talked was that you accept a person for who they are, not the color of their skin, not where they live, not how much money they have or where they go to church, but for the character of that person. And that bode me well at Ole Miss, and it has throughout my life.
What type of reaction did you get from other students? I know that's where it switches, right?
Well, I had one character that followed me around and called me names and accused me of being funded by the NAACP. Dr. Hoare, who was a journalism here, wrote me later, I guess a year or so later, that young man was kicked out of Ole Miss because he was growing marijuana. So I said,
Things haven't changed much, have they?
God works in mysterious ways. But I had sorority sisters. I was a Kappa. I had sorority sisters who, if I went up the main stairs, there were two of them that would spit on me and call me names. So I quickly learned to go up the back stairs. A few years later, well, about 40 years later, we had a reunion, and one of the ladies apologized to me and said if she had known then what she knew now, she would have never done some of those things. I had had a couple of bourbons, and I was not terribly gracious, and I said, "You're 40 years too late," and I walked away. But the main problem was the campus senate, and they wanted to
shock.
they wanted to censor me, CENSOR, and they found they could not do that. But they could try to censure me and say, "You're naughty, lady, and you didn't, live up to Southern traditions," and this type of thing. And ultimately they did. It took quite a while to accomplish that. Even the night that they voted, I think it was several hours. It took them a couple hours to decide whether to let the national media in while they voted. It got a lot of national media, and that I had been a voice of reason had been censured by the university students. Fortunately, the faculty supported me, so that was comforting. And then 40 years later, the campus senate voted to rescind that censure, which was one of the happiest and most eventful days in my life.
Kathleen, one of the things I was talking with some students about earlier is that when the national media horde shows up, things don't always get better. Sometimes it gets worse. Sometimes it does get better. 300 journalists invade Oxford.
That's right.
And show up on campus. Did they make things better or worse?
I wasn't here.
She's a kid.
She's a baby.
I wasn't here in there.
From your research.
From my research.
From what we know now.
I see.
Did they make things better or worse that this attention from the world is focused on the Lyceum?
Did it make it better or worse? I don't know. I can't really answer that.
Okay.
But certainly, there was interest not only in the U.S. about the drama that had been played out over 18 months, but certainly abroad, because other Western European countries were going through some of the same issues in terms of bringing in, I can't pronounce it, but anyhow, whatever. Uh, bringing like France with Algiers with integration into society. And so their eyes were on the U.S. because as still we are, the world looks at us and what we do and that makes countries decide what they perhaps should or should not be doing. And one thing that also, of course, was happening just a few weeks after Meredith came was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, to a certain extent, that whole time period was a period of extremely crucial news and international news coverage.
Jesse, can I just
Yeah,
add
sure,
something else?
sure.
I don't want to leave a bad note on the Kappas. The Knights of Alcohol, otherwise known as KA fraternity,
Okay.
they were circulating a petition to impeach me. And they were going to the different dorms and sorority and fraternity houses. And they came to the Kappa house. My best friend happened, Shotzi Dreve, happened to be the president. And she collected all of the members. And she said, look, you know how I feel, but it's up to you. If you want to sign the petition, you can do that. I'm not going to hold your hands. But none of them signed, well, at least that night, none of them signed the petition. So that was, again, rewarding in that sense.
And Curtis, I'm going to ask you a version of the same question I asked Kathleen, but let me see if I can put some more context on it. I was talking with some Ole Miss students earlier today who have been in Jackson covering the water crisis there. And the people they talked to on the ground wanted the national media to pay attention to it because that's how they felt they would actually get action from local leaders. If the national media is paying attention, then perhaps we will get some action. So that was sort of where I was going, trying to see if would it have happened the exact same way if the national media had ignored Oxford, if it had only been local coverage and no one outside of Oxford paid any attention.
It's hard to imagine because the issue was so enormous that it couldn't have happened because it was too big a story.
Right.
And
did people in Oxford want the national media here?
I suspect some did and some didn't. Some were excited about it, and others were resentful. Probably here on the campus too. But it was a huge story. I can't emphasize too much. It was the biggest story in the world for a few days, taking place right here.
Sorry, go ahead.
You
Let's
had
jump in.
one man, not an organization, one man taking on state government with a well-planned program to reach his goal, which was one, to integrate the University of Mississippi, and one, as Meredith says, to put an end to the white control over the state of Mississippi. One man taking on a whole institution. And of course, the press covered every step. There was step here, all the negotiations, and that just build it up. And there were multiple attempts, and that it became like a gigantic drama, almost like a TV series. What's going to happen next? Stay tuned. We have another event coming up.
What This question is for any of you. What did we learn about
believe
journalism? And
thought
by the
I
way,
had it
this
all.
happens on television too, which is why I leave my phone in the green room.
I thought I had it off. I need some young person to show me how to do it.
It's the KAs calling you.
No, actually, that was an SAE that was calling me.
Touche.
Sorry.
What for all three of you? What is the image that is burned into your head from that time? Obviously, you weren't here, but you like me, we've looked at a lot of material about this.
I'll tell you what it is. Anytime there is an incident on campus, and they still have, this is the lead. At the University of Mississippi, where, a number of years ago, the U.S. Army was called out to quell a riot, something happened.
Right.
Today.
Every time.
Every time. Maybe in the second graph, but it's up there. On the other hand, what happened here also brought a stop to massive resistance to school integration, because all the other schools said, okay, we're not going to go there. We don't want to riot.
We don't want to be them.
We don't want to be them. So there is that. There is that.
That dubious honor.
Yeah, dubious honor.
Curtis, what's the image in your head from that time?
Oh, there's so many dramatic images I have. One unforgettable one, and I was dumb enough to have stayed out there for hours. I think I finally went back. I couldn't get to my room at first because it was a wall of tear gas. There's no way you could get back. But it was maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, and it was either the 82nd Airborne or 101st. I think it was 82nd, in full battle gear, rolling up Sorority Row in Army trucks, bayonets. And I thought, I think at this point it's a good time to try to get back to your room. Again, to demonstrate the enormity of the story, 30,000 troops were deployed to make sure that this university was integrated. Not all of them reached this campus, but we had thousands, and they were bivouacked here. They were on the football field, all our football games. Well, we didn't play many at home in those days, but they were moved. It totally disrupted campus life. Even weeks later, if it would rain, the moisture would bring the tear gas fumes out of the ground again, and you'd be in class and you'd start crying because the tear gas was, thousands of rounds of tear gas were fired that night.
Sidney, what's the image that you see when you think about those times?
One, I was thankful for the tear gas, although as I left to go back to the journalism building, I almost got hit by a Molotov cocktail and crashed. Fortunately, it didn't go off. In those days, girls had to be back in their dorms or sorority houses by 11 o'clock. So I had a deadline and a timeline to get that newspaper out. I did it, but to get back to the Kappa house, the UPI photographer escorted me, thank goodness, because there were bullets going past us. The next morning, I had to go through 3 checkpoints to get from the sorority house to the journalism building. Then that day, I went out to the airport with the UPI photographer. And to see that tiny little airport on one side with troops 10 or more deep, and at the end of the runway, the transport planes coming in and with the troops coming off and the equipment coming off. And I'm thinking, this is supposed to be a university, and look what's happening. I had nightmares for about 5 years afterwards. But so there, it stayed with you, that's for sure.
Just out of curiosity, were classes still going on? Did you still have class responsibility at the same time?
Some were able to have classes, but I think the tear gas affected a number of them, and they just had to be canceled.
But Meredith went to class right after he enrolled at Peabody Hall, Colonial American History.
I cut a lot of classes anyway, so
That's what I was waiting for. That's what I was waiting for. I only have a couple more questions, so I want y'all to, if anyone has any questions for this distinguished panel, please start queuing up your questions. We'll find a microphone and get to you if you have something you want to ask any of our panelists. But until we get to the audience, let's ask all three of you this question. Is the history that we read in the media about the integration of the University of Mississippi accurate? Is it what you would consider what happened? Or is it I don't want to say skewed, but is it a pale reflection of what you saw on campus and what you've read in history? And Curtis, I'll start with you.
I think there are a number of books that have been written about it, and I think they're all essentially accurate. I think probably the best book was Charles Eagle's The Price of Defiance. That was a history professor here at Ole Miss. Charles finished it about 10 years ago, so he had the value of a historian to look back over a number of years. And the crisis didn't start until the book was about halfway over, because he established the context that went on for years here in Mississippi that created the situation. There were a number of contemporary books that came out within a year or so. Walter Lord, who was a very famous popular historian at the time, sort of like David McCullough today, he wrote a book called The Past That Would Not Die that was very good. Then you had Jim Silver, didn't write so much about the riot, but he wrote about the situation in Mississippi and Ole Miss. He was also a history professor here. And he was on his way to being run out of the state anyway, and I think that finished him. I think I don't remember reading anything that I found jarring that was wrong.
Is there anything left to be said, or are we just repeating ourselves over and over now?
Well, I'm a little bit tired of. I feel like a professional expert witness on this thing. But it's a hell of a story, and it's a story of good and evil, and ultimately good triumphed.
Sidney.
I not so much with books, but just in terms of the print media that covered it. It seemed that the Christian Science Monitor did the best job in those days in terms of the accuracy and covering it. But I would say, all in all, they were pretty good because they did their homework and they followed up and they questioned things. And I don't see that in the media today, and that's what really bothers me. It's like people are willing to take a press release and run with it instead of verifying what's really happening and challenging it. Where's the objective reporting?
Now, Kathleen, you think you may have read and talked to more journalists
Yeah.
that were here on that day than anyone else. What did out of state? I almost said foreign journalists, but what did out of state journalists take back with them about Mississippi and Ole Miss?
The South is different from the North. But I think there's still some research areas. I think what we have in academia a lot had sufficient coverage into what was the impact on the black community. All too often on my research, it's all from the white reporters, the white authors, except for Dorothy, and that might be it. And I think there's more we need to know, because we also know that the black community wasn't 100% all in favor of integration. There was dissension within that, I know from my other research. And my colleague Marquita, who's up there, did a chapter in the book to bring that home as to what did African Americans here and throughout the country think about what was happening in 1962 and how it impacted them. And that's something we really haven't explored sufficiently.
That seems like a great area for someone to write a thesis or a dissertation on. It won't be me, by the way, just to be clear. When I left Ole Miss, I was done. All right, so I want to be sure that I leave time for questions from our distinguished audience. We have a microphone here. Raise your hand, and we'll see if we can get the microphone to you. I see, we down here. Tell us who you are, and then ask your question, please.
Stephen Case, I live here in Oxford, retiree. My question has to do with the timing of the involvement with the media. Perhaps naively, I assumed all the national and international coverage had to do with the riots, the deployment of all the troops. But listening to you all this evening gives me the feeling that perhaps the attention had originally been the integration of the university. Which was it? Were the media already here, or did they come once things got tense?
Yes, they were already here. And one of the things that really upset me was George Street, in the part of the administration, would usually try to give a daily update on whether Meredith was going to be admitted or not. And he would come out the door of the Lyceum, and there would be a few students or some of the journalists gathered. One day there was a photographer, and there was nothing to report. And he said, wait a minute, I got about 50 feet of film. I got to get back to New York. Somebody do something, dance or do something. And one student decided to take a Confederate flag and try to climb the flagpole. And so that was the news of the day. And that made me very cynical of the media, national media at that point.
Thank you.
There's one right here, or just come around. No, just coming down to you. And keep your hands up so I can tell them where we're going next.
Oh, lots of questions.
Michael Johansson, retired director of international programs at Ole Miss. Pleasure to be here tonight. As a follow-up to some of the stories that still might be untold, I spent a fascinating evening with a gentleman who was in charge of some of the troops that crossed the border and the difficulty of crossing the border, and that is the Tennessee-Mississippi border, getting to Ole Miss. And I spent about an hour and a half listening to his stories. I'm trying to recall if any of you folks who, and Curtis, and he mentioned some of the best books that have been written about this.
There was a Army lieutenant named Henry Gallagher who eventually was in charge of the security detail for Meredith, and Henry wrote a book about it, published, I believe, by University Press of Mississippi.
Not that long ago.
A soldier's story.
And he talked about his unit was military police, and they were based in New Jersey, and they got sent to Millington near Memphis because they knew they were going to be called upon. And indeed they were when the trouble broke out here Sunday. They didn't know how the hell to get to Oxford. He tells a wonderful story. Henry's done a program here in this auditorium, and they stopped at a service station. Here's a convoy with hundreds of troops, and they stopped at a service station and get one of the maps you used to get for free at a service station. Let's find how did we get to Oxford. And when they got to Oxford, where the hell will we go when we get to Oxford? So, yeah, that was a story that was told. And
A soldier's story.
Henry Gallagher, he's a lawyer in Washington. I talked to him again just the other day.
And I don't think anyone has done the story from the U.S. Marshal's viewpoint. The Marshal story hasn't been told yet. And there are extensive archives available, as well as the Marshal's own historical archives. So there's another research opportunity for someone.
For journalists, authors, and writers, I'm hearing so many books and so many documentaries that are being thrown out for free. Ideas right now.
The name is Don Cole, retired faculty. And I've always heard of it, of the incident as a riot. And I know that if it happened today, that someone would try and take that narrative and perhaps say that it was an extended party from the Kentucky game, etc. And I'm wondering, did that name riot originally stick, or were there other efforts that individuals would try and rephrase that narrative, and were there other names associated with the events aside from riot?
And that's a fabulous question, because I actually was working with the citizens of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as they were trying to reframe the Tulsa race riot as the Tulsa Race Massacre. So that's a really good question. Was it considered to be a riot by people here?
Yes.
Oh, hell yes.
Check.
I have to point out the gentleman who asked the questions, my friend Don Cole, who's one of the heroes here at Ole Miss. He taught here and was later served in one of the executives in the Lyceum. Don was expelled from Ole Miss in 1970 for participating in a civil rights demonstration on campus, and he came back, and so he's one of the people I'm so proud to know, and I think a symbol of how far we've come at this university.
Now, I know you want to jump in there,
I
Kathleen.
did. Technically, according to the Associated Press,
Why is she looking at me?
there
wasn't
is a
born.
definition for when journalists describe
Yes.
incidents, if they are a riot or not. Sadly, if I remember correctly, if someone is killed, it's a riot. If no one is killed, it's not a riot.
And
Is that correct?
let's just say that those definitions are being rewritten daily. Because we actually had that same conversation over what happened in Ferguson, Missouri.
Uh-huh.
Was that a riot? Was that unrest?
Uh-huh.
We have the same conversations when the University of Maryland actually beats somebody in football, and its students celebrate by overturning cars in the middle of Silver Spring, Maryland. Is that a riot? Is that unrest? Or is it a victory celebration?
Right.
So a lot of times it's hard in the heat of the moment, in that first story, to be the person to define what this is. But I don't think anyone from that day forward had any problem calling what happened to Ole Miss a riot. Because I think it 100% was.
They called out the Army.
Right.
They're alone.
Anytime the National Guard has to be called out, I think it's pretty safe to say that it was a riot?
Well, you had 2 dead. You had several hundred wounded. Nobody will ever know how many. Several hundred arrested. Very few of them happened to be students. You had a crazy cashiered U.S. Army general who was also arrested. He was one of the provocateurs who had his name was Edwin Walker, made a crazy speech about a week before the riot, calling upon thousands of people to come and defend Ole Miss against this enemy, a black man in integration. And he appeared on campus, and he got arrested too the next day.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I don't know where the microphone is.
I have it.
Okay. Then you get the question.
Yeah, my name is Jordan Isbell. I'm a freshman here at Ole Miss. I'm majoring in journalism. And my question really revolves around sort of the story of everything that happened with James Meredith. And I believe that entire event sort of captures the identity of courage, inclusion, diversity, and just other facets that makes Mississippi has its own identity. So my question is really 2 questions for you is, how many journalists at that time were aware of the identity that this story was having with Mississippi? And do you believe Mississippi still upholds that same identity, as in the same focal points of courage, inclusion, and diversity?
I will turn to my distinguished panelists and say who wants to tackle that first.
It's yours.
Yeah, we're all looking at you, Curtis.
You know the political scene
Sure.
best.
Well, situations changed so much from 60 years ago to where it is today, where Meredith is recognized as a hero. He's being honored here. He was honored at the 40th anniversary 20 years ago. I think the university didn't think Meredith or a lot of us would be alive for the 50th, and we continue to fool them. And they had a big 50th anniversary, and we're having a 60th. So Meredith is appreciated here, and we'll always be grateful to him for what he accomplished. But there was a period when he was here on campus. It was tough for him. Yep. He was still considered something of a pariah. He was shunned, and it's just an evolution that Meredith's image changed from that of a troublemaker. That was how the Mississippi press had largely characterized him, into this guy recognized as a transcendent figure for this university. I hope I'm being responsive to your question.
One of the things that I will always continue to argue is that journalism's responsibility is not just to inform, but to also educate. And one of the things that we have learned from over the last 60 years is that we need a free media to keep us informed about what's happening in all parts of our country. And we also need a media to continually educate us about our neighbors, about other people who don't live next door to us. Because I personally think that we as Americans sometimes have an empathy problem where we don't always want to understand our neighbors. And one of the things that we can do as an industry is be able to bring these stories and perhaps bring about a little bit more empathy in all of us for people who don't live next door, who are not like us, who don't believe the same things we believe, but we're all still Mississippians and we're all still Americans. Mm-hmm. Now, I will tell you, my TV experience tells me that, when the show is over, you got to go. You got to go. So I'm going to turn back over to Charles. But before we do, how about a great round of applause for this fabulous panel? Thank you. And I'll say one more thing before Charles comes back. Everyone you see here wrote an essay inside this new book, James Meredith, Breaking the Barrier, which you will be able to find a copy of it outside, and perhaps all of our panelists here will be gracious enough to put their names inside of it for you. So if you want to know more and hear more, this book will be available right after we're finishing here. Charles.
I close with three statements. First, thank you, panel. Y'all did a fantastic job. Second, buy Kathleen's book. And third, we have a reception right outside, free food and drink. You can linger and visit with the panelists and one another. Thank you for coming.